Welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. For the next hour or so, we are going to be thinking about this particularly stormy set of lectionary readings set for Proper 7 in Year B. So, Ruth, where are you thinking of going with these readings?
Yeah, well, you couldn't you, go with Mark and the stilling of the storm, but I'm not going to. I'm going to start with Paul and the Second Corinthians letter, and it's one of those ones where Paul's kind of laying it on with a trowel, and he soon loses my sympathy when he gets like this. But thinking of last week, we put 2 Corinthians in a broader context. So he's trying to say to the Corinthians, I've been through all this, but it's a sign of how much I love you. And that love means we're in relationship, and that means you should listen to what I'm saying and follow my advice. I think that's what Paul's saying. So there he is, all the things he's been through, afflictions and hardships and beatings and imprisonment and riots and labours and hungers and sleepless nights, which kind of, as somebody who doesn't suffer too much from lack of sleep, it felt like that's a bit of a wimpy one, isn't there? Compared to being beaten and imprisoned and being in a riot, losing a bit of sleep. But I know if we can't sleep, we can't function very well. So before everyone gets cross with me, I'm sure that's serious too. But he's been through all of that. But he says at the end of it, our heart is wide open to you, and he wants their hearts to be open to him. So for me, there was something here about love that kind of gets through all of this, and despite it all, is there as the thread that goes through all the stuff, which is, and I think it's through all the changing scenes of life, is the hymn that's kind of playing in my head. That all of that we know happens. It would be ridiculous of us to say storms, riots, hardship, hunger don't happen. But Paul's saying he went through all that because he was true to the gospel. And because he's true to the gospel, he wants them to be true to the gospel. He wants them to be in relationship. And that then took me kind of to Job, really, which I still think is the most rubbish answer to the question of suffering. The bit that we all remember. Where were you when I built the hippopotamus? It's like, oh, what? How is that ever an answer? But God's turning the tables on Job. I will question you, and you will answer, where were you? And it's something about the God who is there underneath it all, and that our suffering doesn't mean God isn't present. That in our suffering, just as Paul's faithfulness is the golden thread running through all that he's been through, I think God is partly trying to say to Job, I put all this together, and I'm not going to leave it now. And however awful life is, that doesn't mean I've quit the stage and left you to it. I'm right here. I am the stage. I am the fabric of it. I am within all of it. And I don't think that's the whole answer to suffering. It's a bit better than where were you when I built the hippopotamus, but it's part of our answer to suffering and difficulty is God is there in the meat of it. And then you've got the psalm. If you wanted to link all four, I'm not stealing all of it. Don't panic, the other two. But if you wanted a link, the link between the psalm, that says, "Give thanks to the Lord that God brings the storm and stills the storm." But in that, I didn't want to be heard to be saying, God makes the storms happen to show God's power. But there's something about God is in the storm, but not just as the bringer of the storm, as the one who brings judgment, or who wants to bring us to our knees. It's something much more God with us. That the depth of God's love is shown by the depth of the rescue. But I'll leave Mark, because I think that kind of goes into the same area. It leaves the disciples saying, "Who is this?" And I think there's something here. Suffering's always hard, isn't it, to deal with in a sermon, because you're aware that people are all at different places. But I think I want the whole act of worship to somehow be honest about the suffering, to be honest about the God who rescues us. But that doesn't mean we're going through a bad time, and then God comes in and plucks us out. But there's more that God's in it with us somehow and through it. And I'm always then going to come, I think, to the cross. We talked last week about the 2 Corinthians being very cross-shaped, cruciform, if you want to be posh, at this point of Paul's letter. And I think there's something about Jesus on the cross showing us God's love and the depths of God's love, the distance God will go, the lengths to which God will go to save us. So I think that's kind of where I'm going, but that probably sounds a bit messy, which I hope leaves lots of loose ends for my colleagues to pick up on.
It doesn't sound messy at all. You have left lots of juicy, dangling loose ends that I'm sure we can all grab as we go through this session. And one of the juicy, dangling ends, I think, is Job, isn't it? And this non-answer. Job's made himself perfectly clear what he's asking. He's asking, how can there be any justice in the way you're treating me, God? Come an answer for yourself. And this is a non-answer. I like your hippopotamus one. I also like the ostrich one. Where were you when I made the ostrich? It's pretty stupid, but it can run fast. I mean, what sort of an answer is that? That's pretty much what God says. But it's a tirade, isn't it? This pile upon pile of what do you call questions that you don't expect an answer from? There's a word. Rhetorical questions, that it's a barrage of rhetorical. They only lets up just to say, are you still listening, Job, basically? And then he starts again, another whole chapter full of rhetorical questions. I think the best thing I read about this week, and pretty much all the commentators, this is a non-answer, but actually I think the best thing that I read was someone who said, well, yeah, God's resetting the narrative here, a bit like what you said, Ruth, but Job discovers that what he really needed was not an answer to his questions, but he needed a visit from God. He needed God to show up. And that's pretty much what's happening in Mark. When Jesus is asleep, it's like God's not there, he's nodded off. They were always petrified in the Old Testament about God nodding off. How does your God sleep, sort of thing? And then Jesus shows up. And what Job needed was just for God to visit, for God to show up. And God, in this tirade, in this storm of barrage of rhetorical questions, does show up. And Job seems satisfied with that, or cowed into submission, either of those. But I think it's just glorious that if you just sit back and read the whole thing, that the poetry of it is spectacular, isn't it? I'm tempted simply to read the whole of those 2 chapters, the entire speech, rather than take one bit out, and get an actor, somebody who can do that and just read the whole thing without a script, and it would just be so powerful, I think, to see how the congregation reacted to that. God's got something to say, guys. And then in strides this actor, and out it comes. And you have someone dressed as a hippopotamus or an ostrich, if you like. Rachel. There it goes.
As Ruth was speaking about God's being with us in all that, I was just glancing at the psalm, and the bit in the early verses sort of leapt out at me. Let the redeemed say so, those he's redeemed from trouble and gathered in from the lands. And this idea of kind of we're being gathered in by God. There's something really protective about gathering, isn't there? And just that phrase, gathered in from the lands, from the east and from the west, from the north and from the south, that really kind of leapt out at me as Ruth was speaking.
Yeah, and that whole psalm, again, taking a bit out of it doesn't do it justice, does it? Because there's like 4 or 5 stanzas who describe the situations of the redeemed, and there's a pattern to it, isn't there? They went through this terrible thing, and they cried out to God, and then God rescued them, and I think it's 4 or 5 of them all in a row in Psalm 107. And just to take one out, although that is kind of the most dashing one, those who went out on boats to sea, is one of the most striking, I think. But to read the whole thing, piling them up one on top of the other, emphasizes what Ruth's saying about this message of rescue. Although we do need to deal with this slightly judgy, well, tremendously judgy vibe that's also going on, because most of those categories that the psalmist seems to be suggesting it's their own fault, or God has done this to them. For some of them, it's their own fault because of their sin, and for some of them, God has actually made the storm happen. You do kind of have to deal with that. That's totally absent in Mark. When this storm, there's no suggestion that the storm is the disciples' fault. There's a different vibe in Mark. Maybe that's because people have moved on from understanding the world in that way. By the time we get to Mark, I don't know. There's definitely a tension in Psalm 107, which was another of Ruth's dangly ends, I think, as to how you deal with that. Because if you read it, people are going to say, hang on, God's rescued them from the thing that God sent. how mad is that? So we're going to find some way of dealing with that. And I'm guessing my way of approaching it might be to say that that's the way they saw the world, that it's almost an irreconcilable thing. If you accept there's evil in the world, or there's suffering in the world, or there's danger and hardship in the world, you also hold an idea that God is omnipotent and all those omni things, then unless you think it through, you've automatically got some kind of tension that if something happens, God made it happen. And I think the world moved on from that a bit. Maybe by the time we got to Mark's gospel, they'd moved on from just because it happens, God did it, view of the world. But that's possibly what's going on in the psalm. And it's a tension. There's a dramatic tension in there anyway. Robert, what were you going to do with these readings in terms of preaching?
I found this all quite difficult. The Corinthians I read as, and I might be putting myself into the story, and it's made it even more the more people have spoken, frustration with that. I've done all this, spoken frankly to you. My heart is wide open to you. No restriction in our affections, but only, what more? What more? What more do I have to do? And then that stuff in the psalm, I sort of think about, I can remember sort of years when I was struggling. I wanted to believe, but I couldn't believe because I didn't get answers to my questions. And in a way, it's like the psalm is God's done this. And that people say, well, why should I believe when there's suffering in the world? And it, as you were saying, I think how I sort of came to faith in the end was just that. No, I was going to say that understanding, but that's that I wouldn't understand that it wasn't about answering questions. It was sort of about accepting or being frustrated. It was accepting that God is. And then I'd say that gave me the peace that we see in Jesus in the storms of life. So that's a bit muddly, but that's, I think, and it sort of came down to the word. I was lying in bed thinking about it, thinking I've got to say something about this. And the word that came into my head was, and it's not right, but it's where I was, sort of friendship. That who are your real friends when things get difficult, when things get hard? Where do you find your peace, friend? And it's in God. And for me, it was that when there's nothing else, that I'm desperate in that long dark night of the soul that Ruth never has, because she's asleep. That it's God, because there's nothing else. So God is. There's nothing else, but God is. My friend. That's sort of. I don't know if that makes sense.
Ruth.
Yeah, I thank you. Like me, I think you said it was muddly, but actually what I heard you saying was that, when we have those questions and we have that frustration, that instead of looking for understanding, which is the logical thing to look for, answers to our questions, you went right to Job really with its acceptance. But the idea that relationship is at the heart of it, and I think that's the word I needed for the understanding of what Paul and the Corinthians were doing. That Paul isn't saying, "Oh, look, I've done all this for you." He was saying, through all that, I haven't stopped loving you. We can still be in relationship. We can still together serve God. So I think it's that, it's we all know the frustration and the questions. It's getting to the acceptance and the relationship instead of looking for the understanding and the logic bit. I think that's really helpful.
It is, because I think there's a danger in this Corinthians passage, because there is persecution of the church and persecution of Christians in the world at the moment, a very live and present issue. But I think where I live and in much of the West, there's an unhelpful persecution narrative, which this could easily be if you're not careful. Because I don't think Paul is saying, "Oh, the world is persecuting us." He's not saying that at all. And I think Ruth was right at the beginning to try and pinpoint what it is that Paul is saying. He's not saying, poor us or poor me, I'm persecuted and you're persecuting me, I have rights, blah, 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 and then trying to bash another religion or something and compare himself with them. No, he's saying something else. I read a commentator who said that hearts at the end open, and our hearts are wide open, and open your hearts too. I don't know how right he is because I'm no Greek scholar, but he said really that should be guts or innards. The whole mess of my life is thrown out to you. It's much stronger than hearts, which in our world sort of sounds a little bit sort of nicey, whereas with Paul it's blood and guts are all spewed out for you to see. Yes, Rachel.
Thinking about what Ruth had said in another session about kind of with Paul needing to go back and back and back to find out, how he's got to where he is, and it strikes me that this reading really does build on the reading for last week, which was in chapter 5. So we're being urged to be reconciled to God, and here this being reconciled to God plays itself out in being reconciled to one another. So it's not just that Paul really wants the Corinthians to be his friends, but actually, it's kind of at the heart of the gospel. If we're reconciled to God, somehow we've got to make that work in being in reconciliation with one another.
Yeah, I don't think I'd tied that together. That's really rich. Yeah, thank you for that. There is a storm raging behind your head, Rachel. Where were you thinking of going with these readings?
Well, that's why I moved to the living room, not just because I was really cold in the study, because it's one of my favourite pictures, and I embroidered that one last year. Hokusai's Great Wave.
Wow.
And there's a little tiny boat in there as well. I'll try and find a picture later to see if I can share it. So my theme really is the sea, partly because last week I was thinking about the tree and I like the fact that the tree and the sea rhymes, for no other reason. So I was doing a little bit of exploring about the sea because it does come up in Job and in the Psalm, and in the Old Testament, many people are probably aware it was often a symbol of something that was ominous and threatening and sinister. It was a chaotic force. It was a kind of wild beast, if you like. And I also found something that suggested it's often seen as a barrier to blessing, which I thought was quite interesting. So I'll come back to that in a moment. So I am really focusing on Mark's gospel because I've heard a lot about how this marvelous story tells us about Jesus's power over nature, but it struck me that it's kind of more than that. thinking about the barrier to blessing, one of the examples they gave was the idea of the Exodus, and that, you know, the kind of the Red Sea and then the Jordan. There were these sort of barriers that had to be crossed before they could kind of go into the next stage of blessing. So I was thinking, what if this story is also an act of redemption, if I could say it so grandly? Not just about, oh, you know, Jesus is really powerful and look, you know, the storm is listening to him, but actually maybe Jesus is showing us something about redemption in doing this, and not just showing the disciples that, and they didn't know what was going on at that point anyway, but showing us that redemption and liberation comes in the rebuking of chaotic forces, whatever those chaotic forces might be. So you've got in the story, you've got both the calming presence of Jesus and the power of Jesus. And I was exploring a bit the idea of this power as being timeless. If you do take the sea to be this chaotic force, then it takes us right back to Genesis, and the power of God in bringing about creation. And it also locates Jesus in the acts of liberation that we see in the Exodus, especially the parting the sea. But you know, perhaps we could look at the other chaotic forces. I mean, we've had snakes and all sorts in the Exodus stories, haven't we, over the last months? And I read a phrase that said something about in this story, Jesus is not just giving us a coping strategy, but a promise of salvation. And I really liked that, because often our tendency is to sort of say, well, you know, and it's a good thing to say, well, Jesus is with us in the storms of life, but we kind of focus on, you know, well, Jesus can't really do a lot, but he's there and that's nice. But how does it make us feel if we think about, I don't know, there could be some kind of redemptive act going on, and it's all very half formed in my mind, because I don't want to say, oh, you know, we go through these terrible times and, you know, God's teaching us a lesson about something. I don't, you know, I think there are lessons we can learn, but I certainly don't want to, people who say, oh, you know, these things are sent to try us, really wind me up. So I don't want to sort of say that, but somehow I feel that there's something to explore that's more than just thinking about Jesus as being that comfortable person who's sitting there in the boat with us and therefore it's all okay. But there's something about the power of Jesus, the promise of liberation, I think, that I'd like to explore.
Yeah, Ruth.
So you won't be singing "With Christ in your vessel, you can smile at the storm," which it's just, yeah. I mean, it's hard, isn't it, to give we want to give people reassurance and assurance, but I think you're right to say this is more than just, if you've got Jesus, your life belt on, it's going to be okay, because I think in people's lives it doesn't always feel like that. And at the same time, you don't want to say, oh, well, it's God who sent this to test you. Well, no, you know, my experience and the experience of people around me is that it's not that we all get, you know, and you're not tested further than you can stand. And all. I think there's lots of pitfalls to fall into here, aren't there? But I think something about the being with the disciples in their awe and their wondering. You know, they don't just go, oh, well, that's good, we'll have to make sure we've got Jesus with us every time so that we'll be okay. So maybe when you look more deeply at the story, you do get that sense of the power of Jesus. And but yes, redemption it's tricky. But thank you.
It is a whole lot easier to imagine what's not helpful, to say, because you've touched on pretty much all of them there, and there are some very deep ones that are almost part of common wisdom nowadays, that they're almost like cliches that people say, that have at least some grounding in biblical texts, even though they may be taken out of context and whatever and not thought through deeply. That it's kind of there, and it's very easy to slip into them in trying to be reassuring, isn't it? I was a little bit struck by Job and Rachel talking about the chaotic sea. in that God is described in these verses from Job as the architect, sort of architecty language, measuring stuff out and stuff. But then with the sea, God is described as a midwife, helping a woman give birth to this chaotic sea. There's this rampant, terrible toddler who then has to be sort of bound in and controlled. And I kind of like that buried in there, because you kind of expect Job to go straight to this idea of the sea being a behemoth or the monster, and God, the manly figure, tames the monster. But that's not what this is saying. That this is a midwife helping the sea to be birthed and then bound in or controlled somehow. And where was Job when all this happened? He's no idea of what's going on. But I like the idea of the sea and the parting and the stilling as being a redemptive thing, because the God who was there giving birth to it is the God who loves it, the God who created it, the God who has nurtured it, the God who is ultimately behind all of it, which is the rock and foundation of all of our hope. Yes, Ruth.
Just the in the Oscars, the winning documentary was My Octopus Teacher. And for those who can go to streaming services and watch it, I watched it recently, and it's fabulous for what it will make you think about octopuses, octopodes, octopodes, I think is supposed to be, anyway, the octopus. It's like a Job thing, because at one point it shows a storm, and exactly everything you imagine of a storm at sea, but then it's got footage from below the surface, and if that's the surface of the water, it's chaos up here, and it's chaos for the first bit, and then right down here, completely calm. And all that stuff that gets washed up on the beach after a storm is like the ends of the kelp and stuff, but right down where the kelp is on the seabed, it's calm. Now, I wouldn't want people to hear me saying, so, you've just got to go deep and then you'll discover it's not as bad as you think it is. But it does mean you kind of understand what God's saying to Job, that you're just caught in this bit, and my concern is for the whole of it. And the maker of the documentary describes it as the forest, all this kelp. And it's a wonderful thing that gives you a completely different perspective. And I think it's understanding that God's perspective is all of that, and that our perspective is only part of it. But yeah, what is redemption? Is it not only in the understanding of the depth of it, but also that God can take us to a different point, and the reality that God doesn't just say, if you just calm down and think of it differently, it'll be okay. But God does save us. I think that's where I'm going to want to keep coming back to with this act of worship.
I think that's the kind of thing I often wonder about when people write stuff like we should get rid of wasps because wasps have no purpose. What's the point of wasps? And it's an entirely human-centric view of the world, isn't it? And it's almost like in this book of Job, God is saying, there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more to it than you know, because he says, like, I cause rain in the bits of the desert where no humans live. Why would I do that if it was all about you? It's not about you. It's not all about you. There's a much bigger, there's like the octopodes down the bottom there who aren't even feeling this storm, but I have to think about them too. I'm thinking about the whole big picture. And I think that, I don't know, we can say that and people can draw their own conclusions, can't they? And I don't think we have to spell everything out for them. Where do I fit into this whole picture? It could either make us feel utterly lost, if God's sake, it's not really about you. But I don't think that's what the Bible's saying. God is saying, despite the fact that this whole intricate, huge world is on the agenda, I'm speaking with you, Job. I'm turning up. I'm in the boat with you. I'm awake with you through this. Yeah, Robert.
I find that about the wasps really helpful because I find a lot of this language quite difficult. It doesn't fit with how I think, so I tend to start to switch off. But it reminds me of something I was talking to Gwen the other day about how we haven't had much rain, and oh, wouldn't it be lovely if it would just rain at night? And how I remember when I was a boy that was going to happen. You know, that we were going to be able to organise everything, and it's only, you know, latterly that we've realised, as you're saying, well, you can't mess about with stuff because it has other consequences that you completely don't expect, which sort of is. It's not that I'm not bothered about you, you're nothing, but it's almost as though it's all interconnected, this whole complex thing, and you're part of it. And though you might wonder what's going on, and you might wonder why I'm not, it feels like I'm not protecting you, there's all this stuff, and in it, as I think we said last week, I am there with you. So I still go back. Somebody, I think you said earlier, Phil, about, you know, there are Christians persecuted around the world in a lot worse position than we are. And I sometimes think when you say stuff like that to people, they might think that you're belittling their struggles. And we know that lots and lots of people in our wonderfully sophisticated, advanced society commit suicide. Well, they don't do that because they're happy and comfortable. People do struggle. So I think I still go back to the times when have been most desperate, and the idea of a relationship, or, you know, a friend, a mate, somebody with their arm around you, I find that gets me through sometimes. It's not a comfortable image. It's a grasping out for something to hold, you know, when you're lost and alone in a storm. And so that thing that Ruth said about, or was it Rachel, sorry, at the end of the Mark reading, where they're filled with great awe, they're left not understanding. It's not all just sorted out. There's stuff going on here, but Jesus calms the storm. And I think it's Jesus calms the storm just by his very presence. That gives us enough to calm whatever storm is within us and help us to get through the next day or the next minute, perhaps, you know.
Ooh, yeah, Rachel.
I just was kind of going back to the wasps, and where Robert kind of first began as well. You could link it with the whole kind of ecosystem stuff from last week, in that, you know, we like to think that we're particularly important, but, you know, we'd be lost without all these other forms of life on our planet. If they weren't there, then neither would we be. And I think the sort of environmental movement is encouraging people to see this interdependence, and that, you know, we're because we think we're so clever, actually we've got more responsibility over these things. I don't really know where I was going, actually, but I just felt a connection with last week, thinking about kind of being a blessing on a wider scale, that perhaps just seeing ourselves, not to diminish the suffering that we go through, but I don't know where I'm going, so just move on. My mind has gone confused.
Ruth is coming to rescue you. Right?
Well, redemption. No, but I think thank you for reminding us about a kind of climate crisis and ecology, because I think, again, you wouldn't. I'm full of what you mustn't do, but you wouldn't want to say to somebody, you know, oh, I'm sorry you're having a bad time, but actually, you know, the planet's completely stuffed. It's worse than you think. So I don't want to be doing that to people. But at the same time, I don't think we can say we're just going to worry about this little bit which is affecting each of us, and forget about the bigger crisis and the wider crisis. So it may not have been a finished thought, but it certainly set off in me the idea that somewhere in this act of worship it would be good to say, ostriches, hippopotamuses, isn't it brilliant? But yeah, we have a responsibility for it, and we are made by the God who made all of us and loves us, but loves all that God has made.
Yeah, Robert.
So it's just when Ruth said ostriches, I thought she was going to talk about us not having our heads in the sand.
Good.
I was also, yeah, I was also, I suppose, the thing about the environmental crisis. I feel a slight awareness. I'm not anti it at all, but in the same way that I think 50 years ago we thought we were going to solve things by making the rain only happen at night. I think there's a danger that we think we know all the answers to the environmental crisis now, and in a sense that bit at the end of Mark is a reminder to us that it's bigger, it's all bigger, and we're just at the beginning to understand what we need to do. So we need to be careful, that's all, I suppose.
I think with this Job passage, it's just so clearly not an answer to Job's question. So it's I mean, the Bible's making no pretense at all of answering Job's questions. So there's got to be some point to God deliberately not. It's not that he hasn't misunderstood the question. It's just that Job needs something else. And I think that's perhaps worth thinking, that we don't then make the mistake of saying, well, of course, the answer that God was giving was there, and then to try and answer it ourselves when God said, no, that's not what you need. You don't need an answer to that question. And it's really hard, isn't it? Because you can, here's another thing we shouldn't be saying. We've listed about 12 things we shouldn't be saying now. But I think we're rightly cautious about anything that sounds like, of course, it's all far too complicated for you, so don't worry your pretty little heads about it, because God's too complicated for us. But and the danger of that is there's a kernel of truth in that, because that is what Job is saying. Job is saying God is too big, that this thing is beyond you. There is mystery. So how do you talk about mystery and us dwelling in mystery without saying it's all too complicated for you, so don't worry about not understanding it? It's just a very, very difficult balance, as with all of these things we've said today. So I think what we'll do is we'll sort of we'll highlight the dangers, fellow preachers, and alert you to them, and you can tiptoe your way between these icebergs of unhelpful advice that you might offer your congregation. I've forgotten where we got up to now. Have we gone around the whole circle yet? Yes, we have. Yeah. So I didn't realise that looks like a photograph to me, Rachel. That's absolutely. So maybe we'll come back. Well, maybe we'll come back to that. There's other things that we could do, maybe even particularly with stuff like Job, because it's poetry, and the last thing you want to do with a poem is explain it. Let it speak. So there's other things we can do to bring out the truth of some of these passages, which may be easier to do than trying to preach them. Ruth, what have you come up with?
Well, I had kind of an epiphany, maybe my own little redemption moment, because I was thinking about how do we deal with the cross, because I was still a bit in 2 Corinthians, and for me, the self-giving of God on the cross makes sense of an awful lot of life. It gives meaning to me. It makes me feel that God knows my suffering. But there's all sorts of ways of understanding Jesus on the cross which jar for me, and I don't like. And so I'm going to share a hymn. And I know I'm skating on thin ice here, because at least some people watching will love this hymn. How Deep the Father's Love for Us. It's Stuart Townend. It's a fabulous tune. I'm sure lots of people know it. And this is, here are the lyrics, but on this website, he also talks about how he wrote it. And that the melody came to him kind of, as a melody so clearly in his mind that he thought he'd stolen it. And it does have, it has a great melody, a great hymnic feel. It's very like Calon Lan for me. It's that kind of a, you kind of feel it's almost a classic tune. But every time I sing it, it catches in my throat in this first verse. How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure. He should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. How great the pain of searing loss. The Father turns his face away. There we go. I could barely say it. And every time I want to scream, what? What do you mean? At what point, biblically, theologically, or in any other way, are we left to think that when Jesus was on the cross, God went, oh, can't watch this bit. It's a human feeling, but I'm not here to moan about that line. I'm actually here to say that down here, Stuart Townend says, he doesn't normally write hymns, which I think is really lovely. And he says that a bit later on that someone said, oh, they were amazed to find he's still alive because they love the hymn, but they assumed it was a sort of long dead hymn writer. But he says, I just want to get the quote. Here we go. Here, as I was thinking through, he was thinking about the cross. I started to sing the melody, it flowed. So the melody was pretty instant, but the words took quite a bit of time reworking things, trying to make every line as strong as I could. And I thought about the times that there are sometimes hymns or choruses or whatever where somebody will say to me, oh, I love a certain hymn, a certain chorus, a certain song, and I love that bit. And it's the bit I don't love. And instead of saying, I hope, oh, I don't like that bit, I hope what that does for me is make me think, well, that bit's for them and the other bit's for me. So what I would not do with the congregation is what I've just done and explain to you the bit I don't like. But what I would love to do is to say to people, we're going to sing this hymn, we're going to look at the words. The person who wrote this hymn thought about every line. Every line is his response to thinking about what this act of redemption means. From that, which is your favourite line? Which is the line that brings that home to you? And for me, and partly it's the way that the tune swells and goes with the words. This I know with all my heart, his wounds have paid my ransom. And it's because I don't think I know what his wounds have paid my ransom means in my head. I have all sorts of ways that I don't like it, all sorts of ways I don't understand it, but I know it with all my heart. And I think it takes us to the heart of that meaning, and that's the heart of the Job thing too, that it's not that each little bit makes complete sense like a mathematical equation. It's that somewhere in your heart or in your guts, there is a line here that will help you to understand and embrace. And I'd love to, with the congregation, say, so which is the line that does that for you? Which of these lines does that for you? And someone might want to say, the Father turns his face away, helps them to think about the terrible pain of the cross. Instead of, we talk about it all the time, we have pictures of crosses and crucifixions. It homes in on the real pain and the terror. But I'd love to hear from people which are the lines that make this come alive to them, that speak to their heart and soul. And then we can all sing it all as a piece of poetry, as a hymn, as a piece of music, as a series of statements which put together help us all grasp what redemption might really mean. And it helped me. The next time I sing this hymn, I hope I won't be thinking, ouch, I don't like that line. I'll be thinking, this hymn brings me to an understanding of redemption and the gift of Jesus on the cross.
Thank you, Ruth. No, thank you, because that's just a really powerful way of using a hymn rather than now we'll sing a hymn. I had the experience last week, so it's kind of fresh in my head, of leading worship on Zoom. And because on Zoom you can find music from anywhere, I found a well-known hymn, and I found a recording of some African children singing it with actions, and it was just so glorious and joyful. That's why I picked it. And anyway, somebody wrote to me after the service and said, thank you for the service and for doing this, the other bits of the service. But then they said, and that last hymn, when that came up, I was fully prepared to take off my headphones and leave the room, because that hymn has that verse in about substitutionary atonement, and I could not sing that. And his response was, I would take it off the headphones and left the room. And then he said, but by some miracle, or perhaps by your own genius hymn choosing, they left out that verse. They only sang 3 of them. And I thought, that's such a negative response to him, and your introduction would have stopped that happening. I think it would have allowed him to have looked at the hymn and said, okay, that bit's not for me. I think it's just such a generous way of reading somebody else's words. So I might do that more often. That is really helpful. Thank you. Robert, what have you pulled out of your resources locker?
Well, I found it so difficult that not much really. Just songs about friendship and images of people caught in storms. Nothing really illuminating. I found, as you say, what Ruth said, really, really helpful, because there are hymns that I struggle with and think, well, I love the music, but I don't really want to put those words up. And actually doing that is, I think that's helpful, because it does both things. It makes people look at the words, and perhaps they'll see some of the things that you feel uncomfortable with, but it also allows you to use it because there are other parts that are helpful or make you think, yeah. So no, I've got the first rock band I ever went to see was called Free, 1970, Birmingham Town Hall. They did a fantastic song called Be My Friend. Carole King, When You're Down in Trouble, Toy Story, one of my favourite musicians, Randy Newman, You've Got a Friend in Me. And they're all, well, certainly You've Got a Friend in Me. I love the way Randy Newman uses music that sounds really light and jolly, but then when you actually sit and listen to the words, is incredibly deep. I've got a lot of his stuff. So yeah, and images of, there's a well-known image of a lighthouse with the rain, sea coming all around it, and I thought that's the storm. That was it. But I found it difficult.
Yeah, well, I find this whole discussion fascinating that Ruth's introduced about hymns and other people's words. I know my father-in-law had a church once where I think he was the first one to introduce doing responses, and they hated it.
Oh.
And the reason they gave him was that you're making us say words that aren't our words. And I thought, what are hymns if it's not making you sing words that aren't your? And if you're going to refuse to ever sing or say words that aren't your words, then how on earth are you going to get through life? You need to develop a generous spirit in using other people's words and recognize that that's what they are, but that those words are really are probably, if you've chosen well, those words are well thought through words that may not be for you. And I think that's just really helpful. Rachel.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on what you've all said. That was so helpful, Ruth, to think about things, because I also, if I'm in a congregation when that hymn is chosen, I always have a coughing fit during those sort of couple of lines. Just just so that I don't. But the idea that those lines aren't for me, but there are others who find them helpful. That's really so helpful. I found there've been a number of occasions when I've discovered that when it comes to worship, the idea of sacrificial love flees from a lot of Christians' lives. Well, I don't like that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to sing that. Oh, I don't like it. Oh, you lit a candle and I didn't like that. There's a lot of criticism of, oh, well, I don't want to do that. I don't like that. And I have tried to say to people in the past, perhaps this bit's not for you. Perhaps that, please be generous and tolerate this bit that you don't like, with a gracious spirit, thinking I'm giving this to that person. So just hearing it said about the hymn, it's just been so helpful. I, like Robert, I didn't have like loads of ideas about what other things I might do, but I will try and share my screen now that I've dipped a toe in the water last week. So this is the picture. It's a wood cut by Hokusai, and I've only ever really seen it from a distance, but I've always loved it. And then my mum gave me a kit to embroider it last year, and it wasn't until I was embroidering it that I noticed all the boats in the water, and little heads in the boats as well. There are people kind of crouching down and trying to withstand the waves. So maybe some kind of reflection on the picture, but I would offer an alternative as well, which is very tangential, because one of the reasons why I love this picture is that it reminds me of the Holy Spirit, and I kind of often think about the Holy Spirit as this sort of massive wave, and feel that we're invited to not try and control the wave or flatten it out to make it nice and smooth, but we're just called to go for it, to ride the wave. If I were a surfer, maybe that would be an image I would use. So it makes me feel something about the power of the Holy Spirit and all that's possible by the Spirit, and I'm there in the boat. And sometimes I think, oh Lord, I'm hanging on here, and I don't know what's going on, but I don't know, I feel an optimism about it. So I might lead some kind of reflection that combines both of those sort of elements of it. And I will stop sharing.
That was shared like a pro. No. I have seen that before. That's fantastic. It took me a long time to spot the people. And there's a third boat that I hadn't even seen. Now you've shown it to us. There's another boat that's a bit further through the waves. And I thought, oh, I've not seen that boat before. All the people sort of hunched at the back of those boats. That's absolutely fantastic. And
it leads me back into the Mark reading, actually, now that you've said that, because there's that little line, and other boats were with them. And
yes.
And I always sort of think, well, what was going on? What did they think about all of this? They weren't, it wasn't just one boat in a storm. Perhaps there were lots of people who were just out, doing the night's fishing without, expecting any weather changes at all. What did they make of it all?
That's cool. So maybe Jesus is calming the storm, not just for the people in his boat. A bit like that thing that comes in the John reading we had a couple of weeks ago about, and I have other sheep. Well, what? Other boats? Other sheep? Robert?
Oh, it's slightly off. Where's it gone? Yeah, I was thinking about people not wanting to sing bits or people not liking bits. I do remember at my first church, we had a retired minister, and if I chose a hymn written by a hymn writer who was divorced, he would not sing it. But it also makes me wonder, it's interesting what people bring to worship, that you're trying to, it's this time of mystery. I was also thinking about how sometimes you'll get a feeling that you want to use something in worship. More now we've got Zoom, because you're choosing bits, and often I'll think, I'm not sure whether this is going to make sense, but it just feels like I want to use it. So it's quite a sort of intuitive, emotional experience, and then there are people sitting watching going, I'm not going to, if he does that, and you think, I find that a bit odd. It's strange. Yeah. thought I'd share that.
I sometimes wonder if we change the culture of how worship happens, so that it was entirely acceptable for somebody to get their mobile phone out during a bit that wasn't really, oh, they're doing the candles again, I think I'll just check my Facebook. And if that was okay, because that's what you'd do if you were watching telly with a family and something came on, you'd get your phone out, wouldn't you? And you'd check your face, and then you go, oh, this bit's good. I'll join back. I don't know if that would be a good thing or not. But the whole idea that we all have to sit in rapt attention for the whole thing kind of encourages the idea that we have to like it all. It's not a menu to be dipped in and out of, and it's quite offensive, I suppose, to the preacher who thinks they've spent this whole time crafting this glorious whole where all the bits interweave, and you can't just take a bit of it because you need to listen to it all. I don't know. I'm perfectly happy if people get a mobile phone out during my service.
I suppose it makes me feel a bit like looking at these readings, it was all a bit mysterious and I wasn't sure, and it makes you realise, well, worship's a bit like that, isn't it? There's more going on than we know.
Absolutely. I found a couple of bits. Sometimes we have Neil with us, and if Neil's with us, then we get sort of like proper art therapy. So this is Rembrandt here. I didn't know anything at all about this painting, and I'm not even sure I'd seen it. And one of the reasons I haven't seen it is because somebody nicked it. It's gone missing. This is the missing Rembrandt. But here, this little fella here, I don't know, can you see my arrow on there, or is it just me that can see my arrow? All right, I don't know if it'll come out on the recording. But this guy here holding the rope and looking out directly at the viewer is Rembrandt. It's his face, allegedly. And so I found I think this is an Australian bloke, but I may be wrong, just talking about Rembrandt looking out from this picture.
The 1633 masterpiece, Storm on the Sea of Galilee, was stolen in 1990. It's never been found. If you enter the Boston Museum today, all you'll see is the eerie sight of an empty frame. This painting is based on the story of Jesus and his 12 disciples sailing on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus goes down the back of the boat and decides to have a sleep. But then a huge storm hits.
And I've got hope in my hands. Please keep me warm.
One of the most intriguing aspects of this painting is that Rembrandt has painted himself on the boat. It's as if he's an extra disciple. Now, he's not the guy vomiting over the side here. He's the one holding onto the rope with one hand and his hat with the other. Meanwhile, the disciples go down the back of the boat to wake up Jesus. Why did Rembrandt paint himself on the boat? After all, isn't this a story about Jesus and the disciples? And why was he holding on for grim life? Like many of us, Rembrandt went through plenty of storms in his life. 3 of his 4 children died. Then his wife died. Then his mother died. Then he went bankrupt. Everything was gone. It's no wonder he's holding on. Rembrandt may have been one of the greatest painters in history, but his life was also one of the most tumultuous. I love the timing of this painting. It's painted at the time of crisis. Jesus has just woken up. What no one knows is what happens next. Jesus rose to his feet and he told the waves and wind, "Peace be still." Everything returns to calm, and those in the boat say, "Who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him?"
There you go, you get the idea. I think all the old masters should be animated like that. It just, I think it really helps.
Where were the other boats?
He's holding on to his hat. Yeah, there was other boats. Yep.
And I like the fact that Rembrandt's just like Job.
Exactly. So and then just a little bit, depending if you want to engage your congregation in a little bit about what Jesus's boat might have looked like, because it may surprise you to know they've actually found the boat. Here it is. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I'm an amateur. They found the boat.
I'm here at Gennesaret, a few miles south of Capernaum, and behind me is a first-century fishing boat that was discovered in 1986. I thought this would be a great opportunity to share an authentic artifact that would help put these first-century Sea of Galilee stories into better context. During a major drought here at the Sea of Galilee, two brothers noticed a large oval shape in the muddy shoreline. Representatives of Israel's Department of Antiquities checked it out and confirmed that it
Anyway, yeah, so they found the boat, and it's called the Jesus boat. And it's from the carbon dating or whatever they do, so it's from the time. That's how big it would have been, and so you can see the scale of it, and what it would have looked. And I think that kind of matches most of our ideas about how big this boat might have been. Anyway, so yeah, storms. Difficult times, 12 things not to say to your congregations, icebergs to tiptoe between, but at the heart of it, sort of maybe a resetting of the narrative, of the question, of the context, of God's eye view of what's going on with the world. Has anyone else got anything to say that has come to you before we finish with prayer? No, in which case we've been talking absolute worship. We are going to go on to preach these texts and lead worship as you are too. That's why you've come here. You're probably stuck for ideas, and it's the day before. We hope you've picked up something which will inspire you in your preaching and your worship leading. Ruth is going to lead us in prayer as we prepare for this task.
Thank you. I'm going to begin with a couple of verses from Psalm 107. So let us pray. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. Let them extol him in the congregation of the people and praise him in the assembly of the elders. Loving God, we give you thanks for your word, for your steadfast love, for your wonderful works. We ask that your Holy Spirit might be with us to overwhelm us sometimes, but to lead us as we lead your people, to extol you in the congregation of your people. May our worship be a way of coming close to you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.